But the purpose of today is to try and think through, as the IWA should be all about, not just what this means for us, but what Welsh civil society should be doing about it in advance. What should the demands we start making from next week be? So, Vaughan, perhaps I can start with you. Roger's conclusion was it's going to be close. If there is a narrow no vote, the UK parties around Gordon Brown have said there's going to be a Government of Scotland bill, a Scottish Home Rule bill. Can you tell us what you anticipate will happen in response to a narrow no vote?
Well, one thing that strikes me is I think it may be that in this referendum process that the most important thing has already happened. In other words, that just the possibility that Scotland might vote yes has actually changed the entire political climate in terms of constitutional change. So in that sense, from a Welsh point of view, it might not make that much difference whether it's a yes or a no, because if you like, the dynamics of the whole constitutional change process has changed. And I've always felt very strongly that, you know, the constitutional process in Wales has always been driven by the politics of the Labour Party, and that's not a bad mechanism for delivering constitutional change in Wales, because the Labour Party includes a range of opinions on constitutional issues that broadly reflect the views of the Welsh people. So a compromise within the Labour Party is pretty much likely to be acceptable to people, a broad swathe of the population in Wales. Now, what's happened now, I think, is that this has risen up the agenda for UK politicians. You know, this isn't just a matter anymore for the Wales Labour Party. It isn't just a matter for Wales. It's a matter for everyone. And I think we could be looking at a constitutional open season, if you like, a period of constitutional change that is perhaps like nothing we've ever seen in the United Kingdom before, where questions are going to be asked about how do we build a stable settlement? How do we build a stable state? How do we build, if you like, a new United Kingdom? So if it's a narrow no, you know, how the mechanisms, Caroline talks about a constitutional convention, whether that would be a mechanism, whether it would be a matter for various bilateral talks, I don't know. But I do think in terms of the constitution, we're probably moving into what is one of the most interesting periods. I was going to say living memory. I think it goes beyond living memory, and that's because of what's already happened rather than what's going to happen or what might happen next week.
The stance of the Welsh Government generally is, this thing you want to give us, is it risky? Will I have a lot more responsibility? Will I be paid lavishly for taking it on? If I won't be paid lavishly and there's a lot of risk involved, do you know what? I don't want it anyway. We could have had Network Rail devolved, we could have built the M4, we could have income taxes now, if we wanted them. We don't want them. So as far as the English are concerned, all these guys ever say is, give us more money. Now, why would I bother to have a constitutional convention with people whose only contribution is going to be, give me more money? Forget it.
Okay, thank you, Gerry. There's much to that realpolitik, isn't there, Leanne? And I'm sure supporters of Welsh independence are very excited by what's happening in Scotland. But Gerry's right, the opinion polls for Welsh independence haven't shifted.
I think Gerry said a lot of things that were right there. One being that people need to be involved in Wales in deciding what we want here. And I think that this is a great opportunity to do that. I've just come back from Glasgow, as you said. And what I find really interesting is that as a politician who's been knocking doors for decades now and seeing year-on-year increased apathy, in Scotland there is virtually no apathy that I saw at all. Everyone's engaged, very well informed on the whole, and even people who are yet to make up their minds, they are agonising over the decision. So if we could create a similar sense of mass participation in politics in Wales around the kind of future that we want to pursue here, then we could have something very similar and exciting as well. And the other thing that I agree with Gerry on is the Welsh Government's attitude to all of this. And I think that what Scotland has shown us very clearly is that in order to take a leap forward in this, and to try to get a settlement that you actually need, that is fit for purpose for your country, where people can take decisions as close to the people as possible, then the only way to do that is to change the government, to stop doing what you've always done, and to stop having a government that is led by a Labour Party that we've had in place since the beginning of devolution, and do something very, very differently. And Plaid Cymru is ready to take on the leadership that we need to turn around our country.
So if Roger's gut is right, there could be a narrow yes vote, you're anticipating a boost to Plaid Cymru in particular, but the campaign for Welsh independence in general.
Well, I think people will look north of the border, and we will see something that we've been told since the 1980s, since Thatcher was in power, that there is no alternative to this neoliberal politics that we've seen emanating out of Westminster. I think if there's a yes vote, that we will be able to see a very real alternative to that. And then it's a matter for people in Wales to decide which path we want to take. We can either follow the path that is the Tories with UKIP, pull out of Europe, or we can do what they're doing in Scotland, which I think is much more progressive, much more inclusive, and for me, that's the way I want to see that's the direction I want to see Wales going.
Laura, sitting as you do in Liverpool a lot of the time, viewing all of this, isn't there an equally likely outcome where Scotland goes alone and Wales becomes no bigger really than Greater Birmingham? We're just another bit of an enlarged England.
Well, let me connect up what Leanne said with that question, Lee. I think Leanne's right on some of those points, which is that, and Gerry is on some, although I disagree with a lot of what Gerry said. The reason that Leanne is right is that we do need a much more mature political party scene in Wales, and that's the reason why Scotland is where it is. It's because, whether you agree with it or not, the SNP reinvented itself post-devolution into being a credible party of government. And don't forget, the scale of progress to actually win an election with a majority in a system that was designed not to have majorities is quite breathtaking. So that's the first thing. At the moment, we don't have serious party competition in Wales. That's the brutal reality of how our politics works. That relates back to Gerry's point, which is why the level of maturity of the debate around not only constitutional matters in all honesty, but around policy matters in Wales is so infantile, actually, is probably the best way of presenting it. So that's important. Then you go on to the point, what about England? Well, you know, the reality is the only way there will be an effective system of governance across these isles will be if we move towards something more like a codified federalism rather than a quasi-federalism. And there's a great quote, I remember it from my university undergraduate days, Dicey, talking about the principle of federalism, or the sentiment that underlines federalism, and in this quote here, by the way, is that all of the parties must be committed to the union, but agree it won't be based on unity. Now that is a potential solution to some of the really complex constitutional issues we face for England as much as it is for Wales. Otherwise, you're right, what will be our status in any shape or form? You know, a little bit on the western side of England. I mean, I can't see that the Welsh public will necessarily respond positively to that, and that might in fact be the catalyst for a more mature and engaging politics. But it's a big challenge for the political parties to cope with that.
Vaughan, Gerry was persuasive in saying that the show will simply move on, because the UK political journalists are just itching to write about Clacton, and about UKIP, and about Boris, and about David Cameron's future. And before we know it, we'll have maybe a week of, here's the consequence of the referendum, and the caravan moves on, and Wales's claims are nowhere.
Well, I mean, in the short term, that's certainly true. But you have other questions that are rising. You know, we see all the talk in all three major parties in England about the city regions ideas, for instance. You know, what is the impact of whatever is given to Scotland, if Scotland is still in, or independence for Scotland, if Scotland is out, going to be on the northeast of England? What are the pressures going to be from there? You know, we've already seen Osborne talking about the need to rebalance the economy. So there are other issues around about the balancing of Britain that aren't just to do with Scotland. So I'm sure Gerry's right. You know, the first priority is going to be sort out Scotland, but that doesn't, I think, answer all the questions that are still going to be there. And, you know, Gerry's right about what the knee-jerk reaction is, but it is interesting how much thinking there is going on, and you're right, it's 2,000 academics and 3,000 think tankers or whatever, but people do see these as being major issues that need addressing, in terms of economic imbalance, in terms of questions around the Constitution and West Lothian. You know, those are issues that aren't going to go away. They may disappear off the front page, but that doesn't mean that, you know, once a deal is cut with Scotland, everything is solved.
So Gerry, if you were back in government advising ministers, what would your advice on the tack they should take to try and get the best deal for Wales out of this?
Which ministers am I advising?
Well, you take your pick.
I don't think it's inevitable that Wales has no influence or no voice. I think it's the reality that we have, at the moment, rather little influence and rather little voice. A couple of reasons. We don't have a large number of marginal parliamentary seats that people are interested in fighting. We are a country that currently receives something like at least 12 billion a year in a subsidy from the UK. Our tax receipts are not much more than half our public expenditure in and for Wales. So we're somebody that's being bankrolled by somebody else, and therefore our arguments to them about what they ought to do for us necessarily don't carry as much conviction as they might. But the other thing to say is, and this may sound harsh, but I think it is the case, if you think about what's happened in Wales since devolution, it hasn't been, there's been no disasters. Nobody has done anything terrible to wreck the economy or wreck society or anything like that. But on the other hand, it's quite difficult to point to any area and say, here is an implementation of a policy that has had a very material, measurable effect on outcomes, and look, we've turned this around. We're doing better than you in health, education, economy, any way you like. So we're not interesting. You know, there's nothing we can point to where people say, God, I wonder how they did that. We better check it out because, you know, they've been a bit successful there. There's nothing you can point to like that. We're a bit of a non-story following our devolution. Not a disaster, but just nothing much. And the result of that is, A, they're bailing us out. B, we haven't got anything interesting to say. And when it comes to, you know, to changes in the constitutional settlement, our steady refrain is give us more money. Now, you know, why would they take any notice of any of that, you know? They won't. So my advice to ministers is the Voltaire advice. Tend your garden. You know, we've got to improve things in Wales with the instruments we've got. And then we become much more influential and much more persuasive when we intervene on the broader canvas. And I don't have a magic bullet for this, but I just think, you know, we have to raise our game here if we're going to be taken seriously outside.
Okay, I'd like to come up to the audience for questions. So have a think of a question, but one quick question for Vaughan before we do. I thought it was quite amusing on Sunday. Carwyn Jones put a tweet out in which he said, I paraphrase, but if Scotland's getting powers, Wales should be offered them too. And then over the course of the next 20 minutes, issued a series of clarifications, which was essentially a reflection perhaps of what you were talking about earlier, the nature of the Labour Party's tension on this. Tell us a little bit about his political position and what, because I think we can sense from that instinctively himself, he's ahead of his party on powers, but what kind of wiggle room does he have?
Carwyn gave a very interesting speech in Edinburgh earlier this year, which I don't think actually got quite the attention it deserved, because it seems to me that Carwyn takes the view that there is an element, and I'm trying to avoid the word sovereignty here, but that there is an element of sovereignty that belongs to Wales, and he bases that on what the Good Friday Agreement says about Northern Ireland and what the Edinburgh Agreement says about Scotland. In other words, the last word on the constitutional arrangements of Wales belong to the people of Wales. Now, I don't think that most of the Labour Party is there, but his attitude, I suspect, is not that different, maybe, from what Leanne has been talking about, where she talks about some sort of self-government, where the sort of the Welsh people should decide what powers they leave up in Westminster and what powers they take. Now, it seems to me that Carwyn's position isn't that different, but I think he's a little bit, I don't like to use the word ahead because it implies that it's going in the right direction, but I think he's in a little bit of a different place, perhaps, to where the bulk of the Labour Party is. But I don't sense that there are the sort of tensions in the Labour Party that there were at one time. And when Gerry talks about the caution, I think it is worth remembering. Wales voted yes by 6,000 votes in the 1997 referendum. A government that comes in with a mandate of an institution that's that narrow, I think is almost bound initially to be cautious in the way it uses its powers, because the first job it's got to do is to convince the public that it's not going to do harm, that there aren't going to be disasters. In a sense, with that mandate, the Welsh Government was always, in its early years, going to be pretty risk-averse, and the way Roger Morgan painted it, which, with hindsight, is, I think, looking cleverer and cleverer, was that juxtaposition, the clear red water, if you remember, that, look, you may not have voted for it, but this is what the Welsh Government can do for you. It can smooth off some of the rough edges, some of the things you maybe don't like about the Labour Government in Westminster. We're just there, we're just tweaking it, making sure things are a little bit better for you. And maybe that was the right thing to do in the early days of devolution. Now, whether you just keep on doing that, of course, is not for me to say. That's a political question, but I think that may be the reason that the Welsh Government did take that quite cautious, risk-averse attitude.
Just want to make one point in relation to that, which is that how significant the Labour voters in Scotland are to all of this process, because it was Labour voters who switched to the SNP in order to get an SNP government, in order to get a referendum, and it will be Labour voters, natural Labour voters, who decide the outcome. So I think we've got to contextualise this. In Wales we assume that it will be what Leanne and her party do to advance devolution in some shape or form alongside Labour. And the truth is it will be Labour voters in the Labour Party in Wales who will determine the shape of this future. And I think we miss that point because we assume that Scottish voters are SNP supporters. They're not. They're voters who moved to the SNP because the SNP presented itself as a credible party of government.
Can I make the additional point that came up in Roger's presentation as well about all of those people who have recently been registered? I spoke to many people in Glasgow last week who had never voted, some of them in their 40s and 50s, but they were voting in this election. So, and they would have been Labour voters, they were in that typical demographic to be Labour voters. And I just think something very interesting is happening there, because there's a whole swathe of people in Scotland who are not listening to their leadership. They're doing something very different, and I think that it's very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's have a clutch of questions, and if you could say who you are, please. To the man at the back there, nearest the microphone.
Sorry, yeah. Sid Morgan. I think this has been alluded to but not made explicit. It's not just a constitutional question, is it? It's the question for Wales is about social democracy and the defence of social democracy in Wales, if I could put it that way. My understanding is that the Yes campaign, and the SNP in particular, have taken that social democratic vision, and that is what has attracted what were formerly Labour voters. And therefore, if there is either a yes or no on Scotland, won't we see a sharpening of neoliberalism, affecting Wales, as it were, coming from London? And therefore, that may be the driver rather than the constitutional issue.
Okay, Lisa Turnbull, over here. I'll take three and then we'll let the panel.
Yeah, the panel have more or less sort of answered sort of the question of what would happen if, following the referendum, perhaps with a no vote, that there's a package of greater powers offered. What does that mean for Wales? Is the responsibility too much for us to take? We wouldn't want it anyway. But can I just suggest a slightly different scenario? What happens? We've seen that there's some evidence that there's growing resentment in England, actually, towards the powers and the subsidy, which has already been mentioned, towards the devolved countries. So what happens if there's a very different sort of political outcome, where actually the no vote results in the UK government saying, well, it's quite clear we don't want to go further in this direction. Actually, it's got us nowhere. It's got us more trouble. We're going to reverse direction and actually talk about removing powers, or actually no more powers. In that kind of negative scenario towards devolution in Wales, you know, how then does Wales operate, and how does it try and operate in that kind of environment?
Okay, and the final question for now from John Owen Jones, the former Welsh Office Minister.
Thank you. Stripped down, this is really about money. Scotland joined the Union in the first place because it was bankrupt 200 odd years ago. It may leave now because they're not bankrupt and they're doing quite well and they've got oil wealth. We in Wales are bankrupt. If we had to pay for the services we had, we would be bankrupt. Leanne has said that we need to move politically against neoliberalism, which will come from Westminster, and Westminster will probably be more neoliberal, minus the Scots. But Wales has no option in that the budget set by that neoliberal or whatever government that exists in Westminster will be the budget which Wales operates under. There's no credible alternative whereby Wales is allowed to spend more money from English taxpayers than the English spend on themselves. So if we want a less neoliberal Wales, we can only do it by having a less neoliberal Westminster, unless we find some oil in the Celtic Sea.
Okay. Gerry, can I start with you on the English backlash? UKINIC was warning about this in the 70s. The most recent Future of England survey shows that it's beginning to manifest itself. We saw Prime Minister's questions yesterday, John Redwood and others starting to articulate the case about England needs a response to this. The case for an English Parliament is beginning to be made again. What's your take, if somebody who's spending a lot more time in London, of how England might react and the consequences of that?
Well, I think there's a lag between, a grassroots, somewhat inchoate feeling and what the political establishment actually does before that feeling has expressed itself articulately or taken in the form of a political organization. So I would not give much credence in the near to medium term in a backlash, because I don't think that the current heads of political parties want to antagonize the Scots fatally. I think they think, okay, if we've got away with it, we've got away with it. Let's sort something out. To me, the risk is the reverse. The risk is reverse Danegeld. Give them any amount of money you like so that they don't go. And it would be very easy to do a lot of stupid things. You could easily give them tax concessions that start to erode the tax base of the UK because we get involved in tax competition. That would be very easy to do. We could give them tax concessions that enable them effectively to break up the common market within the UK. So, to me, the real issue will be how do we, given the strong support there will have been for a yes vote, how do we sort of satisfy Scottish aspirations in a way that is economically coherent about keeping a united economy? I'm much less worried that the top English politicians will turn around and say, hey, you lost it, so bugger off. I think that's not really very likely to happen. Now, over the long, I will say this. I think, supposing we get the following scenario. The Scots vote no, so the next government in England is a Lib-Lab coalition, which is what the polls suggest will happen. The Scots are given something which will please some of them and not others. I think the future of the Union will depend on the success of that Lib-Lab government. Because if that Lib-Lab government's a failure, and the Conservatives are back after 5 years, hey, the Scots are going to raise it again. And I think the second time, you will be at risk of an English backlash. At that point, people will say, for God's sake, good news. And I think the second referendum could be fatal for both sides. Partly because the Scots will screw their courage up the second time around, but also because by that time the English will be terminally fed up anyway. So I think the future of the Union probably depends on there being a Labour government after the next election, and that they get some kind of act together and that it's seen as a success so they can get re-elected. I think anything else, English backlash, losing Scotland after a second referendum becomes a very real possibility. But I am not worried about an English backlash affecting the negotiations over Devo Max in the short term.
There isn't a consensus at the unionist level at Westminster, though, about what those tax packages looked like. The Strathclyde Commission for the Conservatives effectively said have latitude over income tax. The Labour Party's own position is trying to hold the line on income tax and not to give flexibility.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why it wasn't possible to present a coherent package as an alternative to independence before the referendum. I mean, they haven't got that sorted out. And there are tensions, because there's no question that Scottish expectations have been raised to a level that are quite difficult to fulfill without doing some damage to the UK's tax base. I mean, if you say, okay, you can have corporation tax, you have the top rate of income tax. I mean, I've heard all this talk about social democratic Scotland, but the only concrete proposal that Salmon's come out with is he's going to cut the top rate of corporation tax to play beggar my neighbour by getting companies into Scotland. Well, that isn't all that social democratic. It's pretty damn well neoliberal. But it's not very clever if you're trying to preserve the tax base for the UK as a whole. So I think there will be grave problems around those negotiations. But as I say, I don't fear that the English will be too grudging. If anything, I'm afraid they'll be too accommodating.
Well, I was thinking about what Roger was saying about Quebec, and Quebec always comes up when these things are happening. I think part of the problem the UK government has is that the things it has to give are economic. What happened in Quebec was that there were cultural concessions that could be made that actually blunted the argument of the separations. Because if you go to Canada now and you get this rigid bilingualism in English-speaking Canada and a rigid monolingualism in French-speaking Canada, and it's the price that English-speaking Canada has paid to create a unified Canada, where the polls suggest that amongst young people, I think I'm right in saying, Roger, support for independence in Quebec is dwindled right down, and it doesn't seem to me the equivalent things that can be given to Scotland. What Scotland are asking for are economic things, and those, raise all the problems that you mentioned.
I think it's worth thinking as well about the what-ifs in terms of the referendum question, because, in some senses, the UK government shot itself so badly in the foot by pushing for a yes or no vote. Had there been the Devo Max option, then some of the more delicate aspects of what powers, policy and fiscal, might have been discussed at that point. And there's no doubt whatsoever that if Devo Max was on the ballot paper, that would have been the most popular option. So this is a series of errors by the UK government in terms of tactics that have led up to this point. Because everyone knows that negotiating after a very difficult referendum campaign is much harder than having got that right and framed something in the shape of Devo Max when that question was originally decided.
Can I just address this point that Wales is bankrupt? I'm not sure if that's an official Labour position, but I have some sympathy with the argument that you make that if Wales was to become independent tomorrow, there would be a shortfall. And that is what, essentially, I find one of the most frustrating aspects of Welsh politics at the moment. We have problems in our economy. We have had the Silk Commission, which has reported and recommended on a cross-party basis that we have some powers over taxation, and we have a government and a First Minister who is saying we don't want those powers. So you have the problem, you have a potential solution, and you don't take that solution. So really, we need to get a grip on this now and start thinking about how we end this dependency culture and start building in some resilience to the Welsh economy. And what we have to do, put very, very simply, is create many more well-paid jobs so that we create a tax base here in Wales. And anybody who says that that's impossible should have been there last night to listen to Laura McAllister's address outside to the sporting people, all from the Commonwealth Games athletes. Because what Laura said last night was that when the Commonwealth Games Team Wales started out, they were told, you'll never reach your targets, Wales is too small, you haven't got enough funding in the bodies that make up what you're trying to put together. And after a series of setbacks, a hostile media, the team came together, united, they were focused, they were determined, they worked hard, and they did the impossible, and they achieved 35 medals for Wales. And if we apply that same logic to the Welsh economy, then we can do wonders. And even if you don't believe that Wales can be an independent country, surely you can believe that we can pull our economy together, and we've got to have some sort of faith and self-belief and confidence that we can do that, I think.
Okay, let's take a clutch of questions. Could Lord Thomas at the front here?
Martin Thomas, Lib Pier, Wrexham. Can I come back to this question of a convention in the event of a no vote? I take issue with Gerry Holtham on this because it seems to me that if in the event of a no vote, very extensive powers are given to Scotland, the West Lothian question, or the English question, really does raise its head. And once you get to that point as to is there going to be an English Parliament or whatever solution is found to that, you then have the problem of the House of Lords. And the House of Lords has to be reformed. It has to be democratically elected on a regional basis so that all parts of the United Kingdom are properly represented in the second chamber. Because you'll have a situation whereby English legislation simply involving England will have to go through the House of Lords as a revising chamber. That will not happen with Scotland. It won't happen with Wales. Well, that's something, an anomaly which cannot continue. And it seems to me that all these things are linked together. So once you start on the route of giving fresh devolution powers to Scotland, everything else follows, and an overall convention to find a solution to it is absolutely essential. And I'm with the people who signed the letter to the Times.
Okay, do we need any further questions before we go back to the panel? Yes, Conductor Davis over here.
I'd like to know how seriously the panel take the idea of the English city regions demanding really serious new powers. And then in connection with that, what sense does it make, or how can you make sense of city regions as such becoming significantly devolved, in isolation, as it were, from their hinterlands? And then the other thing is that all the talk is about the city regions of the north of England, or the Midlands anyway, and the north. So doesn't that sort of lead one to imagine a rather untidy model of regionalisation when only parts of England are enjoying that kind of devolution? And then the third element, of course, in this is, in those circumstances, what happens to England as an entity? And we heard John Redwood saying very trenchantly, didn't we, on Newsnight the other night, we want a parliament for England, full stop. And there are lots of people who are going to be saying that.
Okay, who wants to kick off? Vaughan?
Well, I think what English politicians of all parties are struggling with is that they do think there needs to be some sort of regional tier in England, and yet it's quite clear there's no public demand for it. So how can you use local government, if you like, to deliver that sort of decentralisation? And it did interest me, when we had these votes to a referendum to have directly elected mayors, that the only English city that voted for a directly elected mayor was the one directly opposite Cardiff on the other side of the Bristol Channel. And one of the reasons, apart from a particularly sclerotic council, was that Bristol felt that it was losing out to Cardiff, that Cardiff was delivering, because of devolved government, all these big projects, and there's this old intercity rivalry there going on.
Liverpool.
But you get jealousy, Laura was saying, in Liverpool of Cardiff. So there is some pressure there that enables the politicians to tackle the question of centralisation in England from a different angle. But Cynnog is right in the sense that, what would happen to that rural bit that's halfway between X and Y? Is that still governed directly from Westminster or not? I mean, it's not really been thought through in some ways, but I think it is an attempt to wrestle with the difficulty of a problem that needs solving, but which the obvious solution to which appears fiendishly unpopular with the electorate.
Laura?
Well, connecting the two questions really, I mean, and going back to the constitutional convention idea, I mean, part of the reason why I did disagree with Gerry's comments is because I think if ever there was a time when a convention that does encompass all of the issues that you very rightly raised there, and more, actually, city regions, regionalisation within England, electoral system reform, because there will need to be changes in the composition of the House of Commons and so on. It's now, and I think we either dismiss it as a fanciful idea, or we say actually there could develop a consensus around it, because the reality is the British public at large had a massive constitutional lesson over the past 3 weeks. Far more people now understand the map of devolution than understood it a month ago. Now that doesn't, I'm not being unrealistic here. I'm not suggesting you can walk into any pub in Cardiff and somebody will tell you what the shape of these islands are. I don't suggest that for a moment, but there is a diffusion down to a bigger audience than the one Gerry dismissed in his opening remarks, and that's where I think the whole question about city regions will come into play, because I've done some work on city regions in the northwest, and the reality there is that's a debate purely about the bottom-heavy southeast domination of the economy and politics vis-a-vis the north of England. And so it's political, it's emotional, as well as economic. And that's where a much more encompassed debate around this might actually happen in the future.
Any mathematician will tell you that if you have got a complex series of interrelated problems, the optimal solution consists in looking at it all together and solving the set of simultaneous equations. In theory, you must be right, of course. In practice, in politics, it never works that way. Problems can only be solved when they're compartmentalized, got to be manageable, and solved one at a time. The result then is something seriously suboptimal, viewing it from the higher Platonic point of view, but it's really the only way the politicians find able to proceed. I mean, as I said before, imagine this poor Prime Minister, he's wrestling with this debate, and he's told that's indistinguishable from reforming the House of Lords, solving the problem of English regions. I mean, get out of here. He's going to do it one at a time, because that's the only way he knows how to do it. And the answer, I'm not saying that when they've sorted out Scotland, assuming they do, that there won't be other problems. Of course there will be other problems. Of course there will be inconsistencies. And what will they do? They will try and ease the shoe where it pinches next. They will try and solve them one at a time, sequentially, according to urgency, not importance. Because in politics, the urgent always dominates the important. So that's the way it's going to work. You know it's going to work that way. There isn't going to be a grand convention. There isn't. And the fact is that yes, they will respond to this pressure in England for regional government. The solution will not be coherent. It won't solve the problem of the regions, but it will relieve the immediate pressure where it occurs, and that's the way we're going to proceed, because that's the way we've always proceeded. We're not French. We don't plan, I really think, we've got to... I'm with you. I'd have signed the letter to the Times. It's just that I wouldn't have expected anybody to take any notice.
We didn't either. I would raise some scepticism as well about what actually will be delivered if there was a narrow no vote in Scotland in terms of additional powers for them, because Scots were telling me last week they've heard all this before. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher promised additional powers if Scotland voted no, and they took another 20 years before they ever saw any of those powers delivered. So there are lots of reasons to be sceptical about what will actually be delivered, and we've got to bear in mind that the timetable from now to the UK general election next May, presuming they don't change the date, leaves it a very, very tight timetable to be legislating and doing anything at all. So the message from the Yes campaign in Scotland is if people want more powers in Scotland, the only way to do that is with the Yes vote. And really, if we want more powers in Wales, it's going to be on the back of developments in Scotland as well.
I just want to ask you, Roger, I thought you made a very important point about how calm and peaceful and reasonable the campaign about what is, after all, secession from the state is taking place. It strikes me that in the event of a narrow yes vote, there will be a huge degree of enthusiasm and excitement and expectation, and this is going to take a long time to settle. And from one of the conversations I've seen amongst some of the campaigners, I get a sense that the British state is not going to take this as in a relaxed manner as some people are expecting. They're going to cut up rough and they're going to push back. and some are going to try and refight the campaign through the negotiations, particularly around the currency, around nuclear submarines. And it may be that opinion polls, you know, the yes lead during the negotiations may fall back as people start to get twitchy when they see the reality of what it means. It may be impatience and discontent starts to raise up as people feel their wills.
There's a very good reason why that won't happen. The one thing you can say predictably is if there's a no vote, the negotiations could be quite sour. There could be a lot of recrimination, negative spinning, all of that. If there's a yes vote, I'm going to guarantee you that within 12 hours, Salmon will be saying what a wonderful person Cameron is and how it's very easy to do business with him.
There'll be currency union.
And you will certainly get a currency union. I mean, the stuff you read about currency union, oh, you know, laugh. Please forget it. It's nonsense. There will certainly be a currency union.
And there will be no veto against that currency union from Wales, will there?
Well, who cares? Anyway? I mean, the Scots will give it at least a 10-year temporary lease on Fast Lane. You know, why? Why will they do this?
Good relations.
Because they don't want a financial panic. I mean, the stock market, the yes vote, if the market hasn't been expecting it, it's down 10% that morning. The US opens up, so it's up down 4% at the end of the day. But still, you don't want that going on, right? We've already seen Scots moving their cash out of Scotland and companies saying they're going to move to England. The Scots don't want capital flight. The English don't want a crisis. They don't want a sterling crisis. They don't want a stock market crisis. They're going to make nice. You won't believe how nice they'll be to each other. I mean, you know, in public. So, because basically, nobody has any interest in financial chaos. And therefore, they are going to suddenly discover that things they're telling you are impossible turn out to be remarkably easy to implement. And I think you'd be astounded at how little difference there'll be between independence, when it appears, and Devo Max. I mean, one difference will be, of course, the Scots will have a seat in the General Assembly, and, you know, they'll get a big charge out of that. You know, we're in the community of nations. It's wonderful. I don't know what the psychological effect of that will be over 20 years. Who knows? But in terms of the economic institutions and the framework of the state, you will be astonished at how little difference it makes. And everybody will be as nice as pie. Why? Because they don't have an alternative. They don't have a choice. Cutting up rough in that situation is likely to be suicidal in terms of
I agree with that point. It's in everybody's interests to pull together afterwards. And to be honest with you, I saw no evidence at all of bad nature in the debate, and I've seen some things online. But on the whole, the point that Roger made, when countries forge their independence, in other examples in other parts of the world, there has been conflict in the past in many scenarios, and there's no evidence of anything like that in Scotland. I think that the campaign has been good-natured, and I think it's in everybody's interest, certainly on both sides of the negotiators, to do all they can to get, you know, it's in their best interest to work together.
Before I give you all a chance to have a last word, it seems to me, Laura, one particular medium-term negative consequence for Wales in the event of a yes vote, and that's the in-out referendum. If Scotland does leave and takes a chunk of pro-EU votes with it, it may well be that the polls are still pretty close on the in-out question. In Wales, they seem to be marginally more in favour. But it could well be Scotland leaving would be enough to tip the balance to pull the rest of the UK out of the EU in the event of that referendum. And that could then change opinion within Wales about what kind of union we're part of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing much more to say to that. And I think if we are in a position, lots of ifs there, aren't
yes.
It requires a Conservative government to be re-elected that will then push ahead with the referendum on EU membership. But yeah, all the evidence shows that if that was the composition of the electorate that votes, it's likely to be a vote to come out. I think on balance, though, given the way the polls look in Wales on EU membership, it would require quite a degree of elevating the benefits of EU membership in Wales to make that sufficiently strong to change the political complexion of feeling in Wales at that time.
One thought on that, Lee, of course, is that if David Cameron, and I'm not saying he is, but if he was looking for a convincing reason not to hold a referendum on in-out of the EU, well, there would be no better reason he could advance than a yes vote in Scotland. You know, he could go to the Conservative Party and say, look, we already are facing this huge constitutional change. I know you believe this is an issue of principle, but we have to put the issue of Europe aside while we deal with this other issue. So, you know, I think a yes vote in Scotland would actually make the holding of an in-out referendum less likely.
I think definitely so, and for another reason, that maybe before the Scottish referendum, the Liberals could have been induced to form another coalition government with the Conservatives, accepting that there'd be a referendum on condition that they campaign to remain in. I think anybody's appetite for another dodgy referendum when you've just lost one is going to be really low. And therefore, I think the Liberals would refuse to form a coalition with the Conservatives if the Conservative condition was a manifesto commitment to the referendum. So I think a Scottish yes vote probably undermines fatally the prospect of another con-Lib coalition. So we're either going to get a Lib-Lab coalition or a minority Conservative government. Either way, no referendum.
Conservative UKIP with Boris at the lead? Just throwing it out there.
Well, you know, I mean, of course, everything's possible, but that would require a very substantial move in the opinion polls from where they are now. You know, if we think the opinion polls at the election time won't be so very different from where they are now, it's going to be minority Conservative or Lib-Lab.
Okay, Roger was brave stroke foolish enough to tell us where he thinks this is going to end up. So let's finish with your predictions of the result. I think we can pretty much guess what Leanne's going to say, but we'll let her say it anyway. Leanne, what do you think the result?
Well, I think it could be a yes vote. I think it's likely to be close either way, and I very much hope that it's a yes vote, because I think that has the potential for opening up politics right throughout these isles, and for Wales to be much more of an equal partner in the setup than we are at the moment. So I see huge potential for opening things out, and I've been very excited by what I've seen so far.
Okay, Laura?
Oh, look, you know, it's very difficult, isn't it? So, look, it's impossible to predict, but the point, I think, is that it's already opened up the debate, and the constitutional question has been given such an energy and enlivenment through this whole process that it's got to be a win-win, really. If there is a no vote, there will still be a serious debate about the constitution, whatever people think. And if it's a yes vote, then it will be done under different parameters. Who knows what the outcome is? I don't think we can say.
Vaughan, would you like to be braver?
I'm not going to make a prediction, but I would tell you a story. I was up in Drumchapel, which is a estate to the west of Glasgow, earlier on this year, and I met a guy there who was a guy in his 30s, and he ran a youth centre that was dealing with the most difficult kids on the estate, kids who had problems with substance abuse and so on. And I was talking to him about all of this, and he was incredibly well informed. He said, you know, I've been reading Paul Krugman on the New York Times website, and I've looked at this and looked at this, but I really haven't decided. He said, but I really am looking forward to voting because I never voted before.
Yeah,
now, if somehow we could bottle that, I think we'd have a healthier politics in Wales.
Definitely.
Gerry, would you like to be brave?
No, I think that was inspiring. I wouldn't bet with my own money, but if I was betting with yours, I would probably bet no, and not expressing a preference, just a forecast. And the reason for that is what in economics is known as the patient cake eater theorem. The point is, this is going to be close, right? It's going to be close. So if I vote no, in 5-10 years' time, I'm going to get another chance. You know, it's a leap in the dark. I've always thought yes, but now I'm in the booth, I'm a little bit nervous. And what's occurring to me is, if I vote no this time, I'm going to get another chance. I keep the option. If I vote yes, that's the end of that. I don't have any option left. So, you know, if you eat your cake once, it's gone. If you don't eat it, you've still got the chance of eating it. So I think that fact, the fact that there's an asymmetry in the, plus the essential nervousness that will occur to people when they're taking a leap in the dark, will probably tip it no. I would want to see a 5% yes lead in the polls before being confident that we're going to deliver.
So if not now, in 10 years' time then?
But I think that's very likely. I do. I really do. I think if they vote no now, and we get a Labour government and it doesn't succeed, and the Tories come back, I think the second time round they're gone. Yep.
Please thank the panel for that very stimulating. Thank you.